There's like hearing.
Yeah.
We had a class in 2021. We also are much more comfortable than our.
All right, we good? I welcome everybody to an unusual time for our colloquium. And really appreciate you being here. It's a real pleasure and very special for us to have here Sam Boone. He's currently a faculty member at University of Sydney. And that's new. I'm going to give you a little bit of his background. He got his Bachelor of Science at UMass in physics, and then went on for both his master's and PhD degrees at University of Melbourne in geology. And then he's done postdocs at Mines, at the Mines, at the Institute of Geosciences. And then he's also been a data scientist, AU Scope, Geochem Network, but also a fellow at Adelaide and Melbourne, specializing in thermal chronology, all things thermal chronology. Sam is the go-to person for thermal chronology in its relationship to the evolution of the East African Rift System and Turkana Basin in particular. So it's really a great opportunity for us to have Sam here to talk about the East African Rift today. So, thank you, Sam.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming out. And in particular, thanks to Bill, Greg, and Troy, who's not here, but who have invited me to come today. I met Troy and Greg actually in the field in 2022, and and many of you as well. And everyone's been extremely hospitable and welcoming and collegial. So it's been great to build some collaborations. And I'm really happy to speak to you today. So before I get going, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which most of this work that you'll see has been done. Those are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Melbourne, where I've been done largely based over the last decade or so, as well as the Gadigal people of Sydney, where I'll start a new position in June. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Turkana, Pakat, and Dasanesh people on whose land all of this work has been done. So many of you in the room and online, presumably, are much more familiar with the amazing evolutionary record that is preserved in the Turkana Depression of northern Kenya and southern Ethiopia. I'm going to really be talking about the geological drivers of how that's shaped the landscape and therefore evolution of the species that have inhabited this place for the last, through deep time. But the Turkana region hosts an incredible and perhaps singular archive of hominid fossils, with the various clades of hominid species outlined in boxes there that are preserved in the Turkana region alone, and such as this amazing example of Homo ergaster named the Turkana boy, which was discovered in the northern part of Kenya. Now, the evolution of hominids and then indeed our species of Homo has often been viewed in the changing in the context of global changes in climate since the late Miocene to colder mean global temperatures, as well as increased variability in global temperature, driven both by northern hemisphere glaciation, as well as changes in eccentricity and precession of our planet's orbit. However, increasingly, people are starting to appreciate also the tectonic drivers of landscape evolution, both in isolating populations of different species and essentially, I guess, driving speciation, as well as how that changing landscape due to both a combination of tectonics as well as other mechanisms such as change in global sea level, as well as change in atmosphere and weather patterns, have then essentially funneled migration pathways of early humans. So I'll be talking about the Turkana region predominantly, and here the main tectonic drivers we're talking about are really the development of the Paleogene to recent Afro-Arabian Rift System. This includes the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden that separate Arabia from Africa, and this third branch, the East African Rift System, which heads more or less north to south, down across the Ethiopian plateau and across Turkana, which is located here, and then it continues further southwards. The Turkana Depression, as referred to, is actually a geomorphological feature. It's a large lowland area of relative subdued topography in between the uplifted Ethiopian dome to the north and the East African dome to the south. And it comprises a whole series of individual rift basins. And unlike elsewhere in the East African Rift System, there's actually numerous half-graben basins that are kind of stacked west to east in the Turkana sector of the rift. And it's actually these sediment hosts, or these basins which host the sediment, which many of these fossils are found. Turns out that the Turkana region actually hosts the earliest rift-related magmatism in the entire rift system, the so-called Gamo-Amoro basalts that started to be extruded onto the surface around 45 million years ago. And it also hosts the oldest manifestation of extensional strain. The oldest rift basin is the Lakichar Basin, which is at least Upper Eocene, possibly older. And it's actually from the Turkana region that the rest of the rift then migrated outwards. So this region is really important geologically for understanding actually how rift inception processes occur and what the geological drivers for rifting are. The Afro-Arabian Rift System has developed diachronously above a large low shear wave velocity province, sometimes called the African superplume, which is impinging beneath the East African and Arabian lithosphere. And as a result, there's been profuse volcanism through time. This is a pretty incredible example of Mount Nyiragongo from the western branch of the East African Rift System. But these huge stratovolcanoes reach very, very high elevations, Mount Kilimanjaro being one of those, the largest mountain on the African continent. And in other places, huge piles of basalts have piled up over time, or primarily basalts, but volcanic rocks, which comprise, for instance, much of the Ethiopian plateau. So here you have over a kilometer thick pile of primarily basalts that have extruded over a very large area, more than 1,000 kilometers in diameter. In addition to these, I guess, geodynamically driven bits of high topography, we also have quite prominent tectonically driven topography created by extensional tectonics. So I would say the most amazing example of this is the Rwenzori Mountains in Uganda. As you can see, they're snow-capped, they're even glaciating in places, and the equator runs right through these things. This mountain range reaches elevations of over 5,000 meters in an extensional setting. It's quite remarkable. And this formed as a horse between essentially two different basins. So this is a product of extensional tectonics solely. As you might imagine, those large-scale changes in topography over time have had dramatic effects on atmospheric circulation. So the growth of topography related to rifting has sometimes been attributed to actually starting the Indian monsoon. But in addition, into dissecting what was once an extensive jungle that spanned all the way from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. And once this high topography formed, it essentially created a rain shadow and corresponds to a transition to more xeric landscapes in East Africa, like the savannas in which that region is so famous for. These small-scale, I guess, morphological changes where you have uplifted rift shoulders and downthrown rift basins oftentimes host very, very deep lakes. Quite beautiful example being Lake Kivu in Rwanda, that of course, lead to more, I guess, ecological resource abundance, as well as a greater diversity in environments through time. Elsewhere, some of these rift basins, like in Turkana, are actually quite arid. And again, another type of geomorphological feature that dissects the landscape, and obviously would have important ramifications for the environments in which past animals have lived in. And so it's in this context that people view the natural drivers to primate and eventually hominid evolution in Eastern Africa. And of course, the modern landscape, which is predominantly driven by this interaction of tectonics and climate, still governs the lives of many people in this part of the world today. So if we want to start actually trying to quantify the relationship between how tectonically driven landscape has perhaps driven or affected the evolution of hominids and other primates, or any other flora and fauna species for that matter, through time, we need to be able to essentially address questions about how Turkana and Africa's landscape has evolved through time. This turns out to be actually a very difficult thing to do. For one, we need to be able to disentangle the, I guess, both long wavelength and short wavelength topographic features, where we see across the Ethiopian plateau and East African plateau, we have this broad 1,000-kilometer scale, large scale, geodynamically driven and volcanically driven topography. And that's, and then you have this interference pattern of shorter wavelength topography due to rifting and the formation of these smaller scale rift basins. Now, the sedimentary history of the region is an important archive, of course, of past environments, but it's an incomplete picture. Partially because there's actually, as you go further back in time, we have fewer and fewer records of those time periods, at least preserved at the surface in the form of sedimentary basins. So here I've just highlighted Middle Miocene, Pliocene deposits. I'm sure there's some smaller ones that some of you may have worked in and amongst the area. But as you can see, the geology of the greater Turkana region is dominated by Quaternary cover and lots of volcanics seen in the purples and blues. And then you've got some Neoproterozoic basement sprinkled in between in those pink colors. The other issue, as we've seen, is that I would say as important or possibly more important is constraining past paleotopographic highs. And those are not preserved because we've eroded that material away. So we need to find other proxies for constraining how particularly high topography has formed through time and disappeared through time as well, if we want to better understand this East African landscape that's constantly in flux. Now, there's some unique lines of evidence for large-scale paleotopography. One example of this is a study from Ghani et al. In 2007 that used the incision history of the Ethiopian plateau by the Blue Nile. And basically what they found is as soon as you started extruding these flood basalts between 31 and 29 million years ago, you start creating some amount of topography. But it wasn't until about 11 to 10 million years ago that we see a drastic uptake in incision rates corresponding to increased growth in topography that is thought to be geodynamically driven. So essentially mantle driven, pushing the crust up or the lithosphere up. Another unique line of evidence that probably many of you are aware of is the Turkana whale. And this is essentially that a whale fossil was found in central Turkana. It has a minimum age of 17.1 million years. This is based on a potassium argon age of or date of overlying basaltic layer. And so we know at least 17 million years ago, the topography was not only subdued still in the Turkana region, but also that it couldn't be, Witcher et al. Estimated much more than 30 meters above sea level because this porpoise needed to go essentially something like 500 kilometers inland. So we couldn't have too high of a topographic gradient. But constraining small scale growth in topography is much more challenging, it turns out. Now, one of the few proxies that we have is we can actually use the geochemistry of rocks, techniques that are called thermochronometers to essentially constrain the past exhumation rates in different parts of the crust. The way these work, they're temperature-sensitive radiometric dating techniques. So they what they're actually only telling us is how rocks have cooled over time, which we can use as a proxy for exhumation. This can be used to say, constrain how quickly a valley has been incised or how quickly we've eroded a hill slope, or alternatively, how quickly we've uplifted and exhumed a rift margin. And this is because, in general, temperature of rocks corresponds broadly with depth. So these cooling temperatures can be converted to exhumation rates of rocks towards the Earth's surface, resulting in net cooling through time. We can then numerically model those data to produce thermal histories, such as we see on the left-hand side. And you might have, say, in the case of an extensional basin, you could then perhaps use the cooling rate of rocks exposed on the rift margin as a constraint for the timing and rate of uplift, which has resulted in net cooling. And that's actually how I got involved into working in the Turkana region initially. So primarily working with my main collaborators being Andrew Gleto, Barry Cohn, and Chris Morley. And over the last a bit over a decade or something, we published a number of studies from the Turkana region where we used thermochronology combined with seismic reflection interpretations and structural and sedimentary geology to constrain how rifting is propagated through the Turkana region and East Africa more widely. And what we were able to do by piecing together these different lines of evidence and different proxies for both the exhumation of rift margins and the sedimentary history through time, we're able to show that the stars correspond to periods of cooling as constrained by thermochronology, whereas the dark blue lines are where we have syn rift strata exposed or at least penetrated by wells that we could date directly. And then those dashed blue lines on those timelines represent periods of inferred potential rifting, where, say, we see a sedimentary stack preserved at depth in a basin, but we're unable to penetrate, or those basins aren't, sorry, that the strata aren't exposed, so we can't date them directly. So we've inferred potential timing of rift evolution. But nevertheless, all of these lines of evidence together, and what we see is over time, we have a migration of strain in the Turkana region from west to east, beginning again in the Eocene, as I said, in the so-called Lucky Char Basin. And simultaneously, we see a propagation latitudinally, both towards the north and south of rifting through time. We then, in a separate study, compiled all of these data with actually a continental scale synthesis of all types of different constraints for the timing of both extensional strain and rift-related magmatism to piece together essentially a chronology of how rifting has progressed through time in East Africa. And the key here is that actually it appears that Turkana Depression is also the birthplace of the East African Rift System itself. Now, I won't go too much into detail into these implications of those studies. But what is important here is that if we want to then take those cooling histories of the crust as preserved, or sorry, as recorded by the geochemistry of rocks exposed to the surface today, we ultimately need to be able to perform numerical landscape evolution models. And the key here is that in order to convert changes in temperature of the crust through time, we need to also make assumptions, or ideally educated assumptions, about other properties of the crust through time, namely its thermal and rheological state, which is constantly changing as you continue to deform the crust here. And that will allow us to then convert net cooling to uplift and erosion through time, and then what the topographic response is to that tectonism. And so this is really the main point of my talk today, is that if we want to be able to model how landscape has changed through time, which can then allow us to try to test or quantify relationships between landscape evolution and the evolution and speciation of different animal species, we must first understand the deep time evolution of Turkana so that we can properly model how it's evolved through time. And I'll show two examples why this is really important. One is in the growth of short wavelength topography due to extensional tectonics. So here we're in the South Kerio Basin in central Kenya looking northwards. And we've had downthrow of the hanging wall since the Miocene as this basin is formed, and uplift and erosion of the basin margin in the footwall of that normal fault. Well, it turns out the rheological characteristics of the crust actually will determine how much uplift and then therefore how much topography is developed in the footwall of these normal faults along the basin margins. And so if this, let's say we had a basin that's 10 kilometers in diameter, or sorry, it had 10 kilometers of extension. If that basin were to form in the cold, thick crust of central Kenya, we'd expect about 1.2 kilometers of uplift of that footwall. However, if that same basin forms in Turkana, which is both thinner and hotter, we can expect almost double as much topography. So it's quite clear we need to understand what the thermal state of the rheological state of the crust is back through time, which again is constantly changing. So it's very difficult to quantify, or to constrain rather. And the same is true for long wavelength topography. So as I said before, the Afro-Arabian Rift System has formed due, at least in part, to the impingement of a large mantle plume beneath East Africa. And here I'm showing on the right-hand side a model from Mouche and Forte of what the dynamic topographic component, the mantle-driven topography resulting from this plume impingement is. And we see this elongate, continuous region spanning all the way from East Africa up into Arabia of dynamic topography. However, if we look at the modern topography of today, we see that we don't see a continuous high. We have the Ethiopian plateau to the north and the East African plateau to the south, and this is dissected by the broad lowlands of the Turkana region. And the reason is because it turns out that the Turkana region has much thinner crust than the crust to the north and to the south. It's simply incapable of supporting long wavelength topography today. And this is attributed to an earlier phase of rifting in the Cretaceous that is thought to have cross-cut this region. To the east, it's called the Anza Rift. To the northwest, it's called the South. Well, it's a series of rift basins called the South Sudanese rifts. So as I mentioned before, if we want to understand Turkana today and how its landscape has evolved in the not too distant future from a geologist perspective over say the last 5, 6, 7 million years, we must first understand the long-term tectonic evolution of this region. So I'll spend the rest of the talk talking about 2 new projects in which I'm involved, trying to constrain this deep time history of Turkana, which remarkably we know very little about. The first one is to better quantify really to what extent the Turkana region was affected during Cretaceous, Paleogene, Anza rifting. And the second is actually, for the very first time, to properly characterize both geochronologically, geochemically, and petrographically the Neoproterozoic rocks of Turkana, and what that early formation history, the effects of that early formation history on governing subsequent tectonism. So the first of these studies that I'll talk about is, again, trying to constrain how affected was the Turkana region by Cretaceous Paleogene rifting, and what the implications of that for the long-term crustal structure were. So as I alluded to, that oftentimes the anomalous behavior of the Turkana region, both in its low subdued topography, its antiquity, again, being the earliest part of the East African Rift System to form, as well as its broad distribution of strain compared to the really narrow rifts to the north and south. Those are often always attributed to the fact or to the assumption that this region was highly attenuated and thinned during earlier Cretaceous rifting. So we have Turkana here, and we see that, as I said before, this Anza Rift to the southeast. You have this series of similarly aged Cretaceous, kind of northwest trending rifts to the northwest called the South Sudanese rifts. And these are actually part of a much larger continental scale rift system called the Central African Rift System that expand clear across Africa back into Cretaceous. And simply based on the similar age, orientation, and nature and characteristics of those South Sudanese and Anza Rift systems, it's often long been assumed essentially that these systems once connected through Turkana to form a continuous, I guess, through-going rift system. And an example of this is a study by Samuel Boone and others in tectonics back in 2017, where they performed numerical and analog modeling of rift development in Turkana. And key to their model setup is the fact that they had this through-going rift system that pre-thinned, pre-attenuated the crust in the Turkana region. And they use this to explain why, again, why strain was so widely distributed in the Turkana region. However, it actually turns out we have very little evidence to suggest this was actually true. And this is solely an assumption. If we zoom in on the geological map here, we have very few areas of potentially Cretaceous to Eocene sediment preserved in the region, which may be the eroded remnants of a larger rift system that came that once extended through the area, or they could be completely unrelated epicenters of different age. And the problem is that we have really poor age constraints. The exception to this is the Lepore sandstone, which is preserved in the Lepore Range of the kind of northwest shores of Lake Turkana today. And there we know that this unit started to be deposited at least in the late Cretaceous because it preserves or hosts dinosaur bones. And we know that deposition there continued until the late Eocene because the inner fingers overline Eocene volcanics. Elsewhere, we actually have no direct age constraints, partially because these are all arcosic, so quartzo-feldspathic rich sandstones, things that are difficult to date directly anyhow. And the only other kind of age constraints come from a study in 2019 by Agumeng and others, where they did a comparative detrital zircon uranium lead study of the Lepore sandstone and Muranchak grits to look at, how well do their detrital components compare, at least for as recorded by zircon. And what you see is that in these age spectra, both the Lepore and the Muranchak are comprised primarily of Neoproterozoic zircons. This is unsurprising. All of the basement in this region is Neoproterozoic. But there are two key differences. One is that the Lepore sandstone, again, that unit to the north there, preserves Eocene zircons that aren't preserved in the Muranchak, one providing a minimum age, which is consistent, of course, with the stratigraphy. But then also the Muranchak grits, by contrast, further south, preserve an older Neo-Archean zircon, significant Neo-Archean zircon population, presumably sourced from the Archean Tanzanian craton down to the southwest. But this different detrital population perhaps suggests possibly different age and deposition, but certainly different sources for those sediment. Additionally, we have thermochronology data, which we're in the process of publishing, from basement rocks immediately adjacent to the Muranchak grits. And the thermal history models derived from these thermochronology data for all of our basement samples suggest that these rocks experience a period of significant reheating in the Paleogene, which we've interpreted to be burial or heating due to burial from what was once a more extensive Muranchak grits succession. So again, while Lepore sandstone appears to be late Cretaceous in age, the Muranchak grits look to be a younger unit altogether that was being deposited in the Paleogene. So a more complex picture is arising of Turkana prior to the beginning of the modern rift, where essentially during the Cretaceous, that it kind of acted as a sort of accommodation zone between two separated rift basins, one to the southeast in the Anza, and then the South Sudanese rifts to the north. And that only in the Paleogene do we start seeing significant extension, suggesting that's when the crust is starting to thin. And those basins are clearly oriented in a totally different orientation to be more north-south or north-northeast trending. So this project is, I'm working with Stony Cruden and Pete Betts from Monash University in Australia, and our PhD student, Suyun Bae, who's just started. And the goal of this project is kind of really twofold. One is to try to better constrain the age and nature of all of those so-called Turkana grit deposits that have been lumped together previously. And then to try to address questions, if this system didn't link back in the Cretaceous, these basins are huge. They've 10 kilometers thick in some instances in the Anza and the South Sudan. So it's quite surprising that these things didn't connect in Turkana in a way. So we want to start trying to try to ask questions as to why this may have been the case. So the first portion of that project is working on samples that I collected back in 2022, I think it was. And I went and basically visited all of the various Turkana grits deposits, and I collected samples of overlying and interbedded volcanics, which were dating by argon to provide minimum ages of these deposits. Now, unfortunately, we don't have those overlying basalts in all of the instances, but in some instances we do. I also collected samples of the sandstones themselves, which we're performing detrital apatite and zircon uranium lead on. This is both hopefully to provide minimum ages, but also to essentially characterize the detritus populations of these as another way to kind of compare and contrast these different units. And we've collected underlying basement rocks to perform thermochronology on, and perhaps constrained periods of reheating, which would be associated with burial and deposition of these units, assuming that the thicknesses of these sediments got large enough to actually reset these thermochronometers in the first place. And the second phase of this study, Suyun will be performing a series of analog modeling experiments to test what the role of pre-existing lithospheric architecture has on essentially controlling how Turkana responded to Cretaceous Paleogene rifting. And mainly we're focused on kind of two larger questions. What does the large-scale differences in crustal and lithospheric thickness between the thicker cratonic core of Central Africa and the thinner, essentially, orogenic belts that are preserved across North Africa? What role did this have in governing how Cretaceous-Paleogene rifting affected the Turkana region? As well as how did a series of north-south orogenic belts and related suture zones that formed during the amalgamation of Gondwana, which the Anza and South Sudanese rifts cross-cut obliquely, how did these affect the propagation of rifting at that time? And we know further north from in parts of Ethiopia that this north-south orogenic belt preserves large steps in crustal thickness today, which are thought to correspond with large Proterozoic suture zones during this past orogenic event. So, we'll be explicitly trying to test what are these perhaps acting as a hindrance to the propagation of rifting in the Cretaceous through the Turkana region. So unfortunately, I don't have any preliminary data to show you at this stage, but stay tuned. And I'll spend the last section of the talk talking about this other study where we're now looking to then characterize the Neoproterozoic basement of Turkana. What are these rocks comprised of? And of course, that will tell us about how these rocks will behave as they're strained during different periods of subsequent rifting. And then ultimately, these will be important inputs into landscape evolution models. So this work involves my colleagues from the University of Adelaide, where I did a postdoc a couple of years ago. And I've been working primarily with Alan Collins and Morgan Blades, as well as Laura Morrissey from the University of South Australia. And the preliminary analyses I'll be showing you is from the honors research project of Alice McIntyre, who we co-supervised. And she did a great job finishing up last year. So in 2022, Alan, Morgan, and I, working with Francis Ikai from TBI, basically went all across Turkana, trying to get to as many areas of outcropping Precambrian basement rocks as we possibly could. And we got to, we're fortunate enough to look at many of these basement blocks, with the notable exception of the Lepore ranges in the far north of the basin, which we'd love to return to in the future. And essentially, from our initial observations, we're starting to formulate a broad tectonic framework for the Neoproterozoic in this part of the world. To the far west in Turkana, the basement rocks are comprised primarily of metasedimentary sequences of biotite hornblende gneissic rocks, sometimes intruded by granodioritic sills subparallel to the foliation plains. But as we know that this metasedimentary sequence at some point had to be amalgamated to this old Archean core of Africa, further to this southwest, preserved in the Tanzanian Craton. Those rocks outcrop somewhere down in Uganda. There's a putative ophiolite preserved in Pokot territory at the far western border of Kenya, called the Pokot ophiolite. And this is presumably would have extended further north as well, and this would demarcate a large suture zone. We didn't get far enough west in our field season that year to see this in the flesh, but it would be certainly a target in future fieldwork. As we head further east, however, in rocks exposed in central Turkana, we go into a meta-igneous terrain. In certain places, having experienced quite severe ductile deformation, as preserved in, as you can see in these outcrop images, with that quartz feldspathic pegmatite being absolutely mangled in the top there. And this, as I said, represents a meta-igneous terrain, which we're calling the Lodwar Arc. And further east, we transition back into another metasedimentary sequence, which comprises of garnet-rich, infable plage biotite gneisses, quartzite beds, so metamorphosed of sandstones essentially, and marbles in places. We then, in this pilot study, went and looked at rocks preserved in a metasedimentary belt in the Lacone block. This is in the footwall of the, I guess, the North Carrier Basin. I know many of you have actually worked in this region, probably not looking at the basement rocks, but there's some important fossil sites in this area. And Alice did an incredible job doing petrographic, geochemical, and geochronological analyses of these high-pressure metamorphic rocks that are steeply dipping and preserved in this area. The sequence comprises kind of meter-scale boudins of high-pressure calcsiligate granulates. And we've interpreted the protolith of these rocks to essentially be shallow marine marls. This is due to their high aluminium and calcium content, so low magnesium and iron composition, which together are incompatible with a basaltic protolith. And these are interbedded with metapelitic rocks, so essentially fine-grained sands and clays that have been metamorphosed. So detrital zircon uranium lead data from those calcsiligates suggests that there's a maximum depositional age of these rocks at 864 million years ago in the Neoproterozoic. And the lack of any older zircons in these rocks suggests that the rocks that are now preserved in the Lacone region were not connected to any pre-Neoproterozoic terrains at that time of deposition. So we've interpreted this to represent that Lodwater arc would have formed essentially a volcanic arc system that that was created in a I guess a intraoceanic subduction context, and that those metasedimentary rocks that we see preserved today in the Lacone region were essentially the shallow marine deposits that were forming on the flanks of this. So this means back 860 or so million years ago, Turkana would have looked something like Indonesia today, where you've had a series of basically subduction-related archipelagos forming. Alice, under the guidance of Laura Morrissey, then did some phase equilibrium modeling based on the petrographic work that they did, and she did that for two of those calcsiligate samples. And we overlapped their PT fields. We constrained granulite metamorphism to be in the range of 8.4 to 10.6 kilobars of pressure and 750 to 830 degrees Celsius for peak metamorphic pressure temperature conditions. So this is equivalent to a geothermal gradient of about 17 to 30 degrees Celsius per kilometer, which is a kind of a low to moderate geothermal gradient. And that's consistent with metamorphism during crustal thickening, essentially orogenesis, the creation, collisional tectonics. She then used a range of geochronometers to actually date peak metamorphism. We did this first with uranium-lead analyses of metamorphic titanite, which form essentially a long foliation. We can see that both in the thin section and in the backscatter electron microprobe imaging. And she got ages of between 604 and 622 million years ago. And these were consistent with in situ garnet lutetium hafnium analyses, as well as the age of recrystallized zircon rims that were dated with uranium lead as well. So it gives us a pretty good age constraint on peak metamorphism at around, but sometime between 604 and 625 million years ago. And this actually is in line with the ages of peak metamorphism further north in Ethiopia, and as well as metamorphic rocks further south in southern Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. And again, so we see an evolving tectonic scenario where those intraoceanic arcs and marine sediments were then essentially sandwiched between the Congo-Tanzanian craton to the west and a microcontinent to the east called Azania, as essentially the supercontinent Gondwana formed in the late Neoproterozoic. This mountain range that formed is called the East African origin, and it actually turns out, we think, to be the largest mountain range of the last billion years. So Himalaya scale, but 10,000 kilometers long, which is quite remarkable. So the next steps of that project is going to be to go and, so here's a reconstruction. If we zoom back into where our working model for the tectonic terrains preserved in Turkana is to then, one, go further west and try to actually look for that suture zone between this metasedimentary sequence and the Tanzanian craton to the southwest. And we also know that somewhere to the east, we need to eventually get back into continental crust, or continental protoliths, I should say. And so we need to, it would be great to actually find out where that suture zone is well. Now, where these suture zones are have really important implications for how, of course, the crust will respond to subsequent tectonism, both for understanding how the Cretaceous and Paleogene rifts affected this region, but also what the role of inherited tectonic fabric has played on the development of the modern rift. And it's these parameters of how essentially the crust will respond to subsequent tectonism that will be the input parameters for landscape evolution models. So I'll leave it there and take some questions.
Sam, I'm not a geologist. I'm going to ask you a really naive question. So can you integrate? I am really impressed with how dynamic all of this is, what a mess it is at the end. If you look globally at these kinds of processes, not just at Turkana, is there any way to arrive at a measurement of the rates of these kinds of events over time? In other words, is the tectonic geology of Earth on the timescale of billions of years speeding up, slowing down? Is there any way to answer that question?
This isn't my line of work, but there are certainly people that have modeled what's called the supercontinental cycle.
Yeah.
And they see periods, or some people see a periodicity of something like 600 million years, where you have the growth of supercontinents and then eventual breakup of those continents over time. And it's when you break up these supercontinents that you start getting large rift systems like the East African Rift developing. Those continental fragments then migrate away, and they eventually either go to the other side of the planet and collide together to make a new supercontinent, or they actually retract upon
So
themselves.
rates are being affected by surface events, as opposed to some deep change in the rate of production of heat release from the core or something of that nature.
Well, it's all ultimately driven by asthenospheric processes.
No, I understand that. The
but
question.
But I would handball any questions about geodynamics to Bill and his team, but
I'm probably dragging you
yeah.
into a naive and pointless conversation.
no, it's an interesting question. There are some people that think that the supercontinental cycle is speeding up, but that largely is contingent upon arguments whether things like trying to constrain when past supercontinents actually arrived, and essentially paleogeography of tectonic plates, and that's basically there's huge amounts of uncertainty, as you can imagine, the further back in time we go.
Okay. Thank you.
No worries.
Can you elaborate a bit more on that orthophosphate pegmatite?
Sure. Yep. Anything in particular?
Yeah, maybe just it's what if you know what what else the buildings were found in it, or
So we haven't actually done, and we have samples of it, but like I said, we've only done any petrography and geochemistry on those calcsilicates and the metapelites that they're intercalated with at this stage. The next stage of the project is then actually go and start assessing, particularly the Lodwar Arc, that meta-igneous terrain. And that will include trying to constrain periods of past melting, which those pegmatites record. So beyond their presence and the fact that they're severely deformed, I don't have any other data to share with you at this time.
because I've been doing research on the I've been doing luminescence research on some sediments near the lake,
Okay.
and the one I actually finding potentially I'm going up on soon to find out if there's actually feldspathoids in the feldspar, and that was one of the
Yeah, I'm not sure at this stage. Like I said, we just have hand specimens, so these are just field observations at this stage. Trying to get to this.
I have a question.
Sure.
What role do you think you talk about landscape evolution and understanding the previous tectonic fabric? What role do you think the cratonic lithospheric structure had in shaping not only Anza, but the subsequent Oligocene, Miocene rifting within Turkana,
Sure.
East Africa itself.
So I think, I'll go to another figure. Uh, I mean, what's quite clear to me is that that Central African Rift System, which is thought to have opened explanations that I've read in literature of why this very large continental scale rift system formed in the first place is due to simultaneous opening of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans in the late Jurassic Cretaceous. That essentially there's a propagation of stress through the lithosphere there, forming these rift basins. And it's quite clear, basically, this corresponds to the step from thinner orogenic belts, essentially the so-called Saharan metacraton to the north, and much thicker cratonic core of Africa. So it's clearly seen to essentially avoid the thickest, coldest, strongest part of the lithosphere. Later on in the development of the modern rift, we see the role of that inherited lithospheric architecture, I think, in two major ways. One is so this is actually Cretaceous rift, so this doesn't help us very much actually, but the modern rift basically goes down across Ethiopia into Turkana here, and then it essentially splits into two branches that essentially bifurcate around the Tanzanian Craton. In the east, the eastern branch of the Kenyan rift basically follows first the Arabian-Nubian Shield and the Mozambique belt. These are both Neophotozoic orogenic belts. The difference mainly has to do with metamorphic grade, but all of the rift systems are following that. And then to the west, when the western branch kind of jumps over and goes around the other side of the Tanzanian Craton, it follows a series of Mesoproterozoic orogenic belts. So it's clearly more advantageous for this rift to progress in areas that are these thinner, I guess, weaker areas of the lithosphere. On a smaller scale, we often see orientation or a relationship between the strike and distribution of faults that govern the formation of the modern basins, particularly in Turkana, but elsewhere. And they seem to parallel often the metamorphic fabric preserved in the crystalline basement rocks. So we're seeing this interrelationship on both the, I guess, meso and macro scale.
We have a question from Patrick on Zoom. So Patrick, do you want to unmute, ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me well? Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That's a very good presentation. Thank you very much for presenting that. And it's fascinating, some of the work that you're doing, particularly even focusing on the Turkana grids, which we don't know, we haven't we don't have a very good understanding of all the different grids that are classified as almost coming from Cretaceous or earlier age, especially Muruana-Chok. And I'm also very interested in the work that you're doing with the characterization of the basement or the metamorphics, including petrography and geochronology, because we see a lot of metamorphics sediments in the geologic record in the Pliocene and Pleistocene. So it would be very good to be able to at least know the provenance. So my question or comment was to try and find out your opinion about the association between basalt volcanism, especially between around Oligocene and mid-Pliocene, because we see a lot of basalt volcanism that is associated with faulting structures, particularly with the orientation of the dikes. But then it's just within that time interval. Then after about 2 million years, you see that basalt volcanism stops, and you have all these other different kind of volcanism, including the North and the Central Island and the Beria. So I wanted to hear your opinion about particularly what caused that initial basalt volcanism for that long period of time, and whether we're just taking a break or it's done and we're just going we'll continue having different kind of volcanism instead of basalts.
Thanks, Patrick. I'm certainly not an igneous petrologist, but I don't have a strong opinion, I'll say, as to why we see this. But from my understanding from the literature is some people have suggested that you've had, you know, through time that you started basically having a larger degree of, I guess, crustal contamination through time. So you start transitioning to more siliceous phases. What's strange is that, as you said, then you return back to a phase of basaltic magmatism as well later on in the development of the Turkana Rift. So in short, I don't have a good answer for you, but people like, you know, Tyrone Rooney and others that are working on those problems would be better to address it. But yeah, I'm sorry, I haven't worked much on the igneous rocks.
Okay, yeah, that's still good. So, and just a follow-up question on that. We see some interesting transition between late Miocene and early Pliocene in terms of, because that's the time that when we have the Turkana Basin, the Lake Turkana Basin or the Homo group starting to develop as a coherent basin. And with the Lake Turkana, assuming the morphology of other rift lakes, including Lake Tanganyika and Lake Malawi. So what's your opinion about what happened that time interval between late Miocene and early Pliocene based on the studies that you're doing?
Yeah, that's a good point. I completely agree that we do see the late Miocene, early Pliocene is important, not only in Turkana, but actually on a whole of rift scale. I'll just pull this up here. And that essentially, as the rift is evolved through time, you initially have these kind of rift nucleation zones, the first being in Turkana, but then as well as in the Afar region, at kind of where the intersection of the Red Sea Gulf and Ethiopian rifts are, and as well as an earlier kind of nucleation stage in the Rukku Rift. And it's only, and in the Turkana region, as I said before, a lot of people point to the fact that you've got this earlier history of tectonism that may have, I guess, pre-attenuated the lithosphere there. So it may allow for not only that area to be a nucleation zone of early strain, but also, you know, essentially a funneling mechanism for allowing rift-related magmatism to nucleate there as well. And similarly, in these other sectors, early sectors of the rift, we have pre-existing weaknesses, either and possibly conduits for early volcanism. But it's only later in the late Miocene, Pliocene that we start seeing, as the rifting kind of starts to propagate latitudinally from these early nucleation zones, that you start seeing these light gray, I should say here, the age of these different basins. Darker grays are earlier, older basins, and the lighter grays are younger, and the numbers are broad age constraints. But we see, as you said, we see in the late Miocene, early Pliocene, that's really when most of the rift basins that are preserved throughout the entire rift system really take off, and then we start to form a more continuous rift system. As to why that's happening, you know, I think it's a matter that it just takes time to actually develop some of these rift systems and for these things to propagate. And then eventually, I suppose you reach some sort of threshold where you can start accommodating, I guess, faster amounts of extension at the time. What's happening geodynamically, I'm not sure why. I don't have a good reason for why that's happening. I don't know if it's just simply that the system's progressing and then it reaches some sort of critical threshold, or if there's something changing geodynamically at that time. I'm not sure. But I do agree that that is a critical period on a rift, on the entire scale of the rift, not just in Turkana.
Okay, thank you very much. I look forward to some of the results that you'll be producing.
Thanks very much.
A real quick follow-up to that, it relates to the landscape evolution and hominin evolution as well. Do you see in your thermochronology experiments or observations and in your structural analysis a rapid change in rates of extension around the Miocene-Pliocene boundary, or even possibly younger? And if so, what are your thoughts on that doubling of speed of rifting and the relationship to landscape evolution and hominin evolution? It seems to correspond to the time of rapid extension.
Well, there's an inherent issue or challenge, I think, in constraining past extension rates, namely that the proxies that we're using, whether it be the Cyn-rift sedimentary history, or if it's geochemical proxies in the, say, the rift margins, I don't think they can resolve, well, the time periods at which they can resolve, on the million-year time scale is much larger than, say, we can measure modern day extension rates. So interestingly enough, if you look at just total extension across Turkana, and you essentially average it over the antiquity of that rift basin, the time integrated extension rates are much, much lower than the modern GPS rates suggest. So whether the system has slowed down, rapidly sped up, something like tenfold or something is perhaps, perhaps that's the case. Or alternatively, it's actually, you have periods of really fast extension and periods of really low extension. Now, over time, as the rifts evolve, you do see that you get more, and we see this in the Ethiopian rift, for example. You have a transition from strain predominantly being accommodated by basin bounding fault systems, and you have actually the nucleus of, or the zone of intense strain essentially nucleating towards the rift axis, and you start getting more emplacement of dike swarms as well. So that could explain why perhaps you're getting faster extension rates because of this transition to more igneous driven rifting, or it's simply that it's kind of a extrapolation error, where right now we're in a period of perhaps increased dike intrusion. It's suggesting that the extension rates that we're measuring now are not necessarily represented over million-year time. So the short answer is we haven't been able to resolve high detailed extension rates over time. We can only average them over tens of millions of years based on just how large these rift basins are. So I'd be reluctant to make any large claims about how those things are changing through time, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
No worries, Phil.
All right, well, let's thank, if there are no other questions, let's thank you.
Like you're like, oh, I just have a little question that's